Hey everybody, I'm Lex Smith Washington, and I'm an associate professor of management over here at the Spears School. And I'm also the senior inclusion officer here, which essentially means that it's my job to make sure that Spears is a place that feels welcoming and inclusive to everybody. So that means that we want you to make sure that you feel like you belong here and that you're valued because you bring something unique and important to the table. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit today about unconscious bias. So I study bias and discrimination at work, and unconscious bias is one of those interesting things because unlike discrimination where for the most part you kind of have to intentionally do this thing, unconscious bias operates exactly as it sounds, unconsciously, below the level of conscious thought, meaning you're not really actively or intentionally in meaning to be biased or even thinking about bias. So most people don't think about unconscious bias at all. So it's kind of ironic that I sit here and think about unconscious bias all the time. But I always use a basic example. Unconscious bias operates especially on the tendency our brain makes to connect two things, right? So I've got this pen here. This pen is obviously blue. Every time you see this pen, you're going to see it being blue. If I were suddenly like, this pen is red, you'd be like, no, you're wrong about that. And you'd be right. And no matter how many times I try to tell myself that this pen is red, I'm always going to see it as blue because I have associated the color blue with the appearance and the word blue, right? And so I develop associations over time, and it tends to teach me how things are connected in the world. So I'll give you another example. Birds typically have feathers, right? And they fly, right? And they usually have a beak, and they do typical bird things. So imagine how frustrating it is when your 3-year-old daughter says to you at the zoo, hey mom, is that penguin over there a bird? You kind of scratch your head a little bit because you're like, wait a minute, it never is flying. I don't even know if it has feathers. And it's always swimming around. Birds don't do those kinds of things. I don't know, right? And if I'm pressed for time, if I'm not thinking hard, if I'm distracted, if I'm hungry or tired or whatever, if I don't really think through my answer, I could have ended up giving her the wrong answer, right? And that's kind of how unconscious bias works. We develop an association between two things, like a bird has feathers and flies. Therefore, a penguin, which never flies, cannot be a bird. And we all know that's wrong, but that's what unconscious bias does to us. It builds on a natural system that we have in our brain that helps us to associate things. And it's very hard to break those associations once we've made them. That's why this pen is always going to seem and be blue to you, no matter how many times I try to convince you that it's red, right? Because at the end of the day, you know what blue looks like, and you will always see the color blue as blue. And the same thing happens with unconscious bias. Once we sort of develop an association between two things, like, for example, women and motherhood and men and breadwinning, then it's very hard for us to see the two in opposite roles. For example, with women as breadwinners and men as the primary caregivers. We have already made the assumption that it goes the opposite way. We've already made the association that it goes the opposite way. And so it's very hard for us to disconnect those, but not impossible. Once we've made connections, they're hard to eliminate from our brains, but we don't have to act on our unconscious bias. That's the thing about studying unconscious bias. We start to learn that the things we associate in our mind, they may be automatically and unconsciously associated, but we don't have to act on them. So stereotypes are a form of unconscious bias. And I have all kinds of stereotypes in my head. I'm sure you do too. We've learned them from the society that we live in. And so when we have learned these stereotypes, just because they're automatically activated, just like any other unconscious bias, doesn't mean we have to act on it, right? So a stereotype that's activated does not necessarily mean that you have to apply that stereotype when judging or making decisions about other people. We can use a system of thinking that we call deliberative thinking, where we stop, slow down, process our thoughts more deliberately so that we can make rational, reasonable, and typically more accurate decisions. Unconscious bias relies on what we think of as system one, or default thinking. System one thinking is built for speed. You need to make a decision in a hurry, system one thinking is what you should use. You need to autopilot your way to the store while you're on the phone because you're busy running around the day. System one driving will get you there because your hands know the way, right? You've got a sort of automatic memory, an automatic tendency to go a certain way. Now, when we talk about the notion of system two thinking, if system one thinking is built for speed, system two thinking is built for accuracy. And so if you want to overcome your unconscious bias, you need to start to recognize where your biases are, and then keep in mind, whenever I'm in a position where I might accidentally backdoor into this or step into my own bias, let me remember to turn on my conscious thinking brain, my deliberative thinking brain, and actually think through this decision so that I make the right choice. So now when I take my sons to the zoo and they ask me, hey mom, is that penguin a bird? Guess who knows the right answer? Good luck with class this semester.